I'd always been the kind of wife men like you could rely on. Dinner ready by 6 sharp, Charlie's flannel shirts ironed and hanging neat in the closet, a warm smile waiting when he trudged through the door after a long day at the hardware store. 32 years of marriage, 2 kids grown and gone, a quiet little life tucked away in Boise, Idaho. That was me, Linda Harper, the steady one, the one who kept the wheels turning. Until I found the receipt. It was crumpled in the pocket of Charlie's old Carhartt jacket. $87.43 at the Sagebrush Inn, a rundown motel 30 miles outside town, a place we'd never been together in all our years. I stood in the laundry room, the washer humming behind me, staring at that faded ink like it was a confession written in blood. My hands shook, cold, as if I'd plunged them into a winter creek. Charlie, my Charlie, with his gray stubble and that deep, easy laugh I'd fallen for at 20, had been hiding something. Something big. I didn't storm into the living room and wave it in his face. No, I folded it back into that pocket and let it sit there, burning a hole in my mind. I'd catch him sipping his coffee, humming some old Merle Haggard tune, or flipping through the sports section, and I'd wonder, who was she? Was she younger, with smooth skin and bright eyes? Did she laugh at his corny jokes about fishing lures the way I used to when we were young and broke, dreaming of a house with a porch? I started staring at myself in the bathroom mirror. 56 years old, a little thicker around the waist, lines etching my forehead like trails on a map. Maybe I wasn't enough anymore. Maybe I'd never been. That's when I decided to join the gym. I told Charlie it was about getting healthy, and he barely looked up from his Sudoku, just grunted, "Good for you, Lynn." But it wasn't for him, it was for me. I needed to feel something, anything, besides the slow rot of that receipt eating away at my trust. That's where I met Cade. He was my personal trainer. Broad shoulders, sandy hair, a smile that could light up a room like a July sunrise. Maybe 40, with a voice warm and smooth as bourbon. "You're stronger than you think, Linda," he'd say, adjusting my stance on the treadmill or handing me a 5-pound dumbbell. I liked how he said my name like it was more than just a word, like it meant something. After a few weeks, I stopped obsessing over Charlie's secret quite so much. I started thinking about Cade instead. It started small. He'd linger after my sessions, wiping down equipment, chatting about his weekend hiking in the Sawtooths or how he'd once camped under the stars with nothing but a sleeping bag and a can of beans. I'd laugh, leaning against the weight rack, feeling lighter than I had in years. Then came that Tuesday. The gym was quiet, rain drumming against the big windows, the fluorescent lights buzzing like lazy flies. Cade was there, of course, wearing that gray hoodie that made his hazel eyes pop. I don't know how it happened. Maybe I lingered too long wiping sweat from my neck, or maybe he stepped closer than usual to fix my form on a squat. His hands brushed my waist, firm but soft, and he looked at me, steady and calm. "You can say no," he said, his voice low, barely above the rain. My heart slammed against my ribs, a rhythm I hadn't felt since Charlie and I were dating. I didn't say no. I didn't say anything. I just leaned in, and his lips met mine, quick, tentative, then deeper, like a promise I didn't know I'd been waiting for. For the first time in decades, I felt alive, like I'd woken up from a long, dull sleep. I drove home that night, the rain streaking my windshield, my mind racing faster than the wipers could keep up. Charlie was already in bed, snoring softly, the TV flickering with some late-night fishing show. I stood in the doorway, watching him, that receipt flashing in my head like a neon sign. He'd had his secret. Now I had mine. And God help me, it felt good. Dangerous, sure, but good. I slipped into bed, my skin still tingling where Cade had touched me, and stared at the ceiling, wondering what I'd just set in motion. What do you think so far, fellas? Ever had a moment that turned your world upside down? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. The next morning, I woke up with my stomach twisted in knots, but it wasn't regret, at least not yet. It was something sharper, something alive, like I'd swallowed a live wire and could feel it buzzing through me. Charlie was already gone, off to the hardware store with his thermos of black coffee, same as every day for the last 30 years. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the chipped mug he'd left in the sink, and let the night before play over and over in my head. Cade's hands on my waist, the way his smile tilted just for me, the rain streaking the gym windows as we stood there, closer than we had any right to be. I didn't feel like Linda Harper, the hardware store owner's wife, the mom who'd spent decades packing lunches and folding laundry. I felt like someone else, someone bold, someone wanted. I went back to the gym that afternoon. Told myself it was just for the workout, but I dug out my new leggings from the dresser. The black ones I'd picked up at Target on a whim, the ones that hugged my legs tighter than the faded sweats I'd been living in. Cade was there, leaning against the counter with that easy grin, his hair still damp from a shower. "Back so soon?" he teased, and I laughed, brushing my hair behind my ear like I was 20 again, flirting over beers at a dive bar. We didn't talk about the kiss, not outright, but it hung there between us, thick and warm, like the air before a summer storm. He pushed me harder that day. Extra reps on the leg press, a heavier kettlebell, and every time he said, "You've got this, Linda," it felt like he was talking about more than just the weights. Charlie came home that night, his boots heavy on the porch steps. He slumped into his recliner with a groan, flipping on the TV to some bass fishing tournament, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "How was the gym?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Fine," I said, stirring the chili on the stove, my voice steady, even though my pulse wasn't. I waited for him to look at me, to notice the flush in my cheeks or the way I couldn't quite settle, but he didn't. He just shoveled down his dinner, muttered a "thanks, Lynn," and shuffled off to bed early, leaving me alone with the dishes and my thoughts. I lay awake next to him, his snores filling the room, and wondered how he couldn't hear my heart hammering against my ribs. It went on like that for weeks. Cade, and I didn't cross any big lines. Not the ones you're probably imagining, but there were moments that felt just as dangerous. His hand lingering on my shoulder after a stretch, a quiet coffee at the shop next to the gym where he'd ask about my day, and actually listen. I started telling him things I hadn't said out loud in years, how I'd wanted to be a painter once, back before Charlie and the kids, and the mortgage swallowed that dream whole. He'd nod, his hazel eyes locked on mine, and say, "You should pick up a brush again, Linda. You've got a spark, don't let it fade." Charlie hadn't called me anything close to spark since Reagan was in office. Then came the day I saw her. I was dropping off Charlie's lunch at the store, a turkey sandwich on rye, same as always, when she walked in. Blonde, maybe 45, with a laugh that sliced through the jingle of the door chime like a knife. She marched right up to Charlie at the counter, handed him a set of keys, and said, "You left these at my place last night." He fumbled, his face going redder than a barn in a sunset, muttering something about a work thing, while I stood there, the sandwich bag crinkling in my grip. She didn't even glance my way, just turned and left, her heels clicking on the linoleum. Charlie wouldn't meet my eyes after that, just took the lunch and said, "Thanks, Lynn," like nothing had happened. I didn't call him out. I didn't say a word. But that night, I didn't go home after the gym. I drove straight to Cade's place instead. His apartment was a mess of hiking boots and dog-eared paperbacks, but it smelled like cedar and fresh coffee, warm and real. He didn't ask why I was there, didn't push me to explain the mascara streaking down my cheeks. He just handed me a glass of water and sat across from me on his lumpy couch, waiting. "He's been lying to me," I finally said, my voice splintering like old wood. "I saw her today. She's real, Cade." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his jaw tight. "You deserve better than lies, Linda," he said, and it wasn't some smooth-talking line. It was raw, honest, like he meant it down to his bones. I don't know why, but that's when I reached for his hand. His fingers closed around mine, rough and steady, and I didn't pull away. Not then. Not yet. Cade's apartment became my refuge after that night. Small as it was, cluttered with topographic maps pinned to the walls, a pair of muddy hiking boots by the door, a stack of worn Louis L'Amour novels on the coffee table, It felt like a pocket of air in a life that had started to choke me. He didn't push, didn't ask for more than I was ready to give. That first time, when I showed up with tears staining my blouse, we just talked. Hours of it, pouring out of me like I'd been holding my breath for years. I told him about the receipt from the Sagebrush Inn, about the blonde with the keys, about how Charlie's work thing excuse sounded thinner than the ice on a March pond. Cade listened, his hazel eyes steady, nodding like he was piecing me together. "You're not invisible, Linda," he said at one point, his voice low and sure. He reached for my hand again, and I let him hold it, his calluses brushing my skin like a quiet promise. After that, I started finding reasons to see him. Coffee turned into dinners, hole-in-the-wall joints in Meridian or Nampa, places where Boise folks didn't go. We'd sit in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, splitting a plate of fries, and he'd tell me stories, how he grew up in Montana, fishing with his dad on the Yellowstone River, or the time he got lost in the Bitterroots and slept under a pine tree till dawn. I'd laugh at his terrible bear growl impression, the sound bubbling out of me like it hadn't in decades. It wasn't just the attention, though that was part of it. It was how he saw me. Not as Charlie's wife, not as the mom who'd raised 2 kids and kept a house running, but as Linda, the woman who once dreamed of painting canvases full of Idaho sunsets. With him, I remembered her. At home, Charlie was a shadow of himself, or maybe I was the shadow, drifting through our life like a ghost. He'd come in late some nights, smelling faintly of sawdust and something floral I couldn't place, and I'd pretend not to notice. "Busy day?" I'd ask, stirring whatever was on the stove, chili, stew, something to keep my hands busy. "Yeah, inventory's a mess," he'd grunt, and that was that. He didn't ask where I'd been when I started staying out later, didn't comment on the new sweater I'd bought or the way I'd started wearing my hair down instead of up in a messy bun. I wondered if he was too wrapped up in his own secrets to see mine, or if he just didn't care anymore. Either way, it made me reckless. I started texting Cade from the kitchen, my phone hidden behind a cookbook, smiling at his replies while Charlie snored in the recliner. Then came the night that tipped everything sideways. It was a Friday, late November, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Cade picked me up after dinner. Charlie thought I was at a friend's, and we drove up into the foothills in his beat-up Tacoma. The road twisted through dark pines, the sky above us a spill of stars brighter than anything in Boise. He pulled over near a lookout, cut the engine, and we sat there, the silence thick with something unspoken. "Linda," he said finally, turning to me, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "What are we doing here?" I knew he didn't just mean the drive. He meant us, me, him, this tightrope we'd been walking. My mouth went dry. I could have laughed it off, could have said, "Just enjoying the view," and gone back to my safe little life. But I didn't. I leaned across the seat, my heart pounding like a drum, and kissed him. It was quick at first, desperate, then slower, deeper, like we were sinking into something we couldn't climb out of. He kissed me back, his hand cupping my face, and for that moment, I didn't care about Charlie or the blonde or the lies piling up like snowdrifts. I felt free. The ride back was quiet, his hand resting on mine on the gearshift, the heater humming against the cold seeping through the windows. He dropped me off a block from home, and I walked the rest of the way, my breath fogging in the night air, my lips still tingling. Charlie was asleep when I slipped inside, the TV flickering with some infomercial about steak knives. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him, the gray stubble on his chin, the familiar slope of his shoulders under the quilt, and felt a pang I couldn't name. Not guilt, not yet, but something close. I crawled into bed, careful not to wake him, and lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying that kiss until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. I told myself it was just one night, one slip, that I could pull back any time. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself as much as Charlie had been lying to me. Freedom's a tricky thing. It feels like a rush of fresh air until you realize it's pulling you under like a riptide. That kiss in Cade's truck stayed with me, looping through my mind like an old country song I couldn't turn off. The next day at the gym, Cade didn't push. He just flashed that tilted smile, like we'd shared a private joke instead of a moment that cracked my world open. Good form, he said, adjusting my stance on the rowing machine, his voice casual, but his eyes lingered a beat too long. I smiled back, my cheeks warm, and kept going, pushing harder than I needed to, like I could sweat out the confusion churning inside me. But it didn't work. I'd catch myself humming "Take It Easy" in the grocery store, or staring out the kitchen window while the coffee brewed, and there it was again, his hand on my face, the stars overhead, that fleeting taste of something wild. Charlie started picking up on something, though he couldn't pin it down. Not the big stuff. He didn't catch the way my phone buzzed with Cade's texts under the table, or how I'd linger in the bathroom, brushing my hair longer than I had in years. But he'd squint at me over his oatmeal some mornings, spoon halfway to his mouth, and say, "You're different lately, Lynn. Everything okay?" His voice was gruff, tired, like he was asking about the weather instead of me. I'd shrug, mumble, "Just the gem, I guess," and he'd nod, letting it drop. I waited for him to dig deeper, to see the flush in my cheeks or the way my eyes darted away, but he didn't. Maybe he was too busy with his own shadows, the blonde, the late nights, to notice mine. Or maybe he didn't want to know. Either way, it fueled me. I started meeting Cade more. Lunch at a diner in Meridian. A walk along the Boise River, where the cottonwoods rustled in the breeze. Little stolen hours that felt like mine alone. Then came the close call that nearly undid me. It was a Tuesday, gray and damp, and I told Charlie I was going to a book club. Never mind that I hadn't cracked a novel since the kids were in diapers. I was with Cade instead, at a little Italian place called Tony's, tucked away off the highway. The lights were low, the tablecloths red and checkered, and we were laughing over a plate of spaghetti, his foot nudging mine under the table. I was mid-sentence, telling him about the time I'd burned a Thanksgiving turkey to a crisp when I saw him, Tom Delaney, Charlie's fishing buddy from way back, walking in with his wife, Mary. My stomach dropped like a stone. I ducked my head, staring at the pasta like it held the meaning of life, my pulse hammering in my ears.
Cade caught on fast.
"Old friend," he whispered, sipping his water, cool as ever. I nodded, barely breathing, praying Tom wouldn't glance our way. He didn't, thank God, just shuffled to a booth in the back, but my appetite was gone. Cade drove me home after, his hand on my knee, the silence heavy between us. "You okay?" he asked when we pulled up a street away from my house. "Yeah," I lied, and slipped out into the dusk. That night, I dreamed of Charlie finding out. Not yelling or throwing things, just standing there, his brown eyes sad and worn, like a dog left out in the rain. He turned and walked away, fading into the dark, and I woke up gasping, sweat soaking my nightgown. Charlie snored beside me, oblivious, his arm flung across the quilt. I stared at the ceiling until the alarm clock glowed 5 a.m., telling myself I could stop this. Pull back from Cade, patch things up with Charlie, go back to being the Linda I'd always been. But the next day, my phone pinged while I was folding laundry. It was Cade, a picture, a pencil sketch he'd done of me, all soft lines and a smile I hadn't seen in my mirror in years. "This is how I see you," he wrote. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it, my throat tight, my fingers trembling over the screen. I didn't text back right away, but I knew then I wasn't stopping.
Not yet.
The holidays barreled in like a freight train. Thanksgiving prep, the kids coming home, Charlie dragging out the ladder to string lights on the porch. I played my part, basting the turkey, nodding at our daughter's stories about her new job in Seattle, laughing at our son's bad jokes about his college roommate. But I was hollow, going through the motions like a wind-up doll. Cade texted me that week. He was in Montana visiting family, and every "miss you" he sent hit me like a jolt, waking me up when I'd started to numb out. I'd hide my phone under a cookbook, typing quick replies while Charlie carved the bird, my heart racing like I was 16 again. I told myself it was harmless, just words, but then I saw her car. Black Friday, driving past the hardware store, a red Honda Civic parked out front, the blonde in the driver's seat, texting someone. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, wondering if it was Charlie on the other end. That night, he came home late, smelling like pine and perfume, and I didn't ask. I just texted Cade. I need to see you. Cade didn't hesitate when I texted him. It was the Saturday after Thanksgiving, the air crisp and biting, the ground dusted with the first snowflakes of the season. I told Charlie I was running errands, groceries, maybe a stop at the craft store for Christmas wreath supplies, and he just nodded, hunched over the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. Take your time, he said, his voice flat, like he was talking to the wall. I grabbed my coat and drove out of Boise, past the subdivisions and strip malls, to a park near Eagle where Cade was waiting. He stood by his truck, breath fogging in the cold, his hands stuffed in the pockets of a fleece-lined jacket. When he saw me, he smiled, soft, steady, like he'd been saving it just for me, and I felt that buzz again, the one that drowned out the noise in my head. We walked along a trail, the snow crunching under our boots, the bare trees stretching like skeletons against the gray sky. I shivered, and he shrugged off his jacket, draping it over my shoulders without a word. It smelled like him, cedar and a hint of sweat, and I pulled it tighter, letting the warmth sink in. You're shaking, he said, stepping closer, his arm brushing mine. It's not just the cold, I admitted, my voice small, and he stopped, turning to face me. His hazel eyes searched mine, and for a second, I thought he'd kiss me again, but he didn't. He just took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and we kept walking. It was simple, quiet, but it felt bigger than anything I'd had with Charlie in years. I let myself pretend, just for that hour, that this was my life. No lies, no hardware store, no blonde in a red Honda, just me and Cade and the snow falling soft around us. He stopped by a bench overlooking the river, the water sluggish and dark under a thin skim of ice. Linda, he said, his voice low, almost lost in the wind, I'm falling for you. My breath caught, sharp and cold in my chest. I wanted to say it back. God, I did, those 3 words clawing at my throat, begging to get out. But they wouldn't come. They sat there, heavy with 32 years of marriage, 2 kids, a mortgage, a life I couldn't just erase. I looked at him, his sandy hair dusted with snow, his jaw tight with something like hope, and I couldn't speak. Before I could figure out what to do, I saw it. Charlie's old Ford, rumbling past on the road above the park. He didn't stop, didn't turn his head, but my heart seized like I'd been caught red-handed. I pulled my hand from Cade's, stepping back, my voice shaking. I can't do this, I said, and he didn't argue. He just nodded, his eyes darkening, and watched me walk away. I drove home, tears blurring the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel. Charlie was in the garage when I got there, tinkering with the snowblower, a smear of grease on his cheek. Where you been? He asked, not looking up, his tone as casual as if I'd just stepped out for milk. Out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and he didn't push. I stood there, watching him, the way his shoulders slumped, the gray streaking his hair more than I'd noticed before, and saw a man I didn't know anymore. Or maybe I was the one who'd changed. He looked old, worn, and suddenly so did I. I went inside, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, and stood at the sink, staring at the backyard where the kids used to play, now empty and silent under the snow. The next week I stopped going to the gym, stopped texting Cade. I told myself it was over, that I dodged a bullet, that I could glue my life back together and pretend none of it had happened. Charlie didn't suspect anything, or if he did, he buried it under his fishing magazines and quiet grunts. I threw myself into Christmas, baking sugar cookies with too much frosting, wrapping gifts in shiny paper, humming Silent Night, like it could drown out the ache in my chest. But it didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Cade's face, that sketch he'd drawn, the way he'd said my name like it was something precious. Then I'd see Charlie, shuffling through the house in his worn slippers, and the pang would hit again, sharper each time. I'd wanted to feel alive, to strike back at Charlie's secrets with my own, but now I just felt lost, like I'd wandered too far from shore and couldn't find my way back. The snow kept falling outside, blanketing Boise in white, and I wondered if it could cover up everything I'd done, or if I'd carry it with me forever. The snow piled up outside that December, turning Boise into a postcard I didn't feel part of anymore. I kept busy, too busy, trying to outrun the mess I'd made. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, the oven churning out batch after batch of cookies, the living room cluttered with wrapping paper and ribbon. Charlie strung the last of the Christmas lights on the porch, grumbling about the cold, and I nodded along, basting the ham, hanging ornaments, anything to keep my hands moving so my mind wouldn't. Our daughter, Jenny, came home from Seattle with stories about her tech job, and our son, Matt, drove up from Boise State with a duffel bag full of dirty laundry and a grin I used to live for. I smiled, laughed at the right times, passed the mashed potatoes at dinner, but it was like I was watching myself from across the room. Linda Harper, the good wife, the good mom, playing a role I'd forgotten the lines to. Cade didn't text again after that day in the park, and I didn't reach out either. I deleted his number, tossed the sketch he'd drawn into the bottom of a drawer under old tax returns, told myself it was done. But it wasn't. I'd be folding towels or stirring gravy, and there he'd be, his voice in my head, low and warm, saying, "You're stronger than you think, Linda," or that look in his eyes when he'd said he was falling for me. I'd shake it off, turn up the radio, but then I'd catch Charlie out of the corner of my eye, shuffling to the garage with his coffee, flipping through a fishing catalog, and the weight would settle back in, heavier each time. I'd wanted to hurt him, to match his secrets with mine, but all I'd done was carve a hole in myself I didn't know how to fill. One night, after the kids had gone to bed and Charlie was snoring upstairs, I dug out that receipt again. I'd kept it, hidden in a jewelry box under a tangle of cheap necklaces, like some kind of twisted keepsake. The Sagebrush Inn, $87.43, dated 6 months back. I sat on the couch, the Christmas tree lights blinking red and green across the room, and typed the name into my phone. Up came the website, a squat, faded motel with a neon sign, the kind of place you'd pass on the highway and forget a mile later. Hourly rates, stained carpet in the photos, reviews complaining about thin walls and lukewarm showers. My stomach churned. Charlie had been there. With her, the blonde with the keys, the laugh that cut through me like glass. I pictured him, his broad hands on someone else, his dumb fishing jokes making her smile, and the hurt flared hot and sharp. But then I saw myself, kissing Cade in his truck, laughing over spaghetti at Tony's, holding his hand in the snow, and the heat turned cold, sinking into my bones. I wasn't better than him. I was just as lost. I broke that night, alone in the dark. The tears came fast, soaking the dish towel I clutched to my face, muffling the sobs so I wouldn't wake anyone. I didn't call Cade, didn't shake Charlie awake to confess or confront him. I just sat there, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge, and let it all crash over me. I'd thought my secret with Cade would set me free, give me back the pieces of myself I'd lost over the years. But it hadn't. It left me hollow, a stranger in my own skin. I'd wanted to feel alive, to prove I wasn't invisible, but all I'd done was build a cage of guilt and regret, and I'd locked myself inside. Christmas morning came, gray and soft with more snow. Charlie handed me a mug of coffee, his fingers brushing mine, and said, "Merry Christmas, Lynn," with that tired half-smile I used to love. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man I'd built a life with, the one who'd held my hand through labor, who'd danced with me at Jenny's wedding even though he hated dancing. His hair was grayer, his eyes lined with years I'd been part of, and I wondered who that blonde was to him, if she mattered the way Cade had to me. I didn't ask. I didn't know if I ever would. But as we sat there, the kids tearing into their gifts, I felt it, the ache of what I'd done, what I'd risked, what I'd lost chasing something I couldn't hold on to. I regretted it. All of it. Not because I got caught, but because I'd betrayed myself as much as I'd betrayed him. Now I'm here, spilling this out, staring at the words like they might fix me. I don't feel free anymore, fellas. I feel small and sad and sorry in a way that sticks to your ribs. Maybe that's the real truth. You can't outrun yourself, no matter how many secrets you keep or how far you stray. I don't know if Charlie and I can mend this, if he'll ever tell me about her, if I'll ever tell him about Cade. But I know I wish I'd stopped before I started. What about you? Ever wandered too far from home and wished you could turn back?
Drop a comment.